everyone for being here for this power session. Just a reminder, I'm Renee Chow. If we haven't met, I'm the chair of LCAA this year and a Leadership Columbia graduate of 2015. And glad to see some familiar faces and some new names and everything on our chat. And so power sessions are just kind of some quick 30-minute sessions that we started this year just to be another virtual opportunity and something that, you know, is available for professional development during the continued virtual life that we're living right now still. And so we're really pleased with us today. He is a leadership teacher and coach with the John Maxwell team. But prior to that, he was in a Palmetto Health executive, I almost said Prisma, and spent time at that hospital system and others as CEO. So he's seen a lot of different leadership situations and had to have a lot of tough conversations in that time. And we're honored to have him. And Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you and just encourage everyone that will save a little bit of time for questions. And if you can add those in the chat feature, we'll get to those at the end.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you for the invitation, ladies of the Leadership Columbia. This is a great honor for me to be able to speak to you on a very difficult subject. I understand you want to talk about tough conversations. Let me just say that I'm going to refer to this as constructive conversations. So I'm going to put it in a little different context by calling it a constructive conversation. And there's so many, there's a wide range of conversations we can have. I'm going to narrow the focus down today to supervisor-subordinate conversations about behavior and performance. So with that in mind, let me just go ahead and say what I'm talking about when I talk about behavior and performance. Behavior is how a person conducts himself at work. It has everything to do with positive attitude and friendliness and manners and how cooperative they are and all the many variables involved with people skills. Performance is how you carry out your job description. It lists in there exactly what you're expected to do each and every day. And what we know is that performance can generally be measured. There are metrics there in terms of things like productivity, error rates, customer service satisfaction, financial results, and the list goes on and on. So I'm going to be talking about conversations between a supervisor and subordinate, including issues regarding behavior and performance. Why do we dread this conversation? That's how I want to start out, because in my 50-something years of experience, people do not like having these conversations. And I think there are a couple of reasons. The number one reason that we don't like them is that we're afraid. There is an uncertainty of what the person we're speaking with may say or do. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. They may be totally silent. They may not even respond. They may not talk with us. That's one end of the extreme. Then in the middle, you've got, they may disagree. They may not believe that you are correct. They may argue with you. They may even become emotional and violent over the content of what you're discussing. And I've even seen a case where a person would storm out of the room. In fact, the example where the person left the room during this constructive conversation, the leader chased the employee down the hall, still continuing to have the conversation. The person went to human resources after that occurred and reported the leader for threatening and intimidating behavior. So human resources asked the leader to take 3 days off and think about it. So it was a very unusual situation, but it's just to illustrate the fact that we're not sure what we're going to get into when we get into these conversations. There's uncertainty, and we're a little afraid of that uncertainty. The other reason we don't like it is just unpleasant. as humans, we just want to be cheerleaders. We want to deliver positive news. We want to share things with people that uplift them. And this many times is not uplifting, pleasant information to share. Now, I want to describe what I refer to as the ideal scenario. So this is kind of setting the stage for the employee and leader relationship. Leaders should have regular coaching sessions with their employees, I think on a frequency of once a month. And this is a private one-on-one between the supervisor and the subordinate, in which they cover two components, two parts. Part A is project status. Where are you with what you're working on? And part two is individual development. So that is something that happens on an ongoing, regular basis that both the supervisor and the subordinate feel like is a routine thing. It's not, every now and then or even never, but it happens on a regular basis. So the fact is, we already have this routine set up where we have these conversations. Now, I want to discuss 6 key points. And again, for those who may have missed it, I have these notes that I will be sending to Renee electronically that she can forward to you. And I want to talk about 6 key points of what I call the constructive conversation. Key point number 1 is duty. The leader has a duty, has a requirement to perform certain tasks. And a leader's primary duty is to develop their people to their full potential. You may think about a lot of different things that you have to get done on any given day or in any given period, but nothing is more important than developing people to their full potential. So the first key point is duty. The second key point is courage. When the need for a constructive conversation comes up, it would be so much easier to just ignore it or avoid it. So it takes courage to confront this situation and address it. It's just easier not to. So this is where the leader has to have courage. The third key point is expectation. The common reason that people do not behave or perform at a certain level is the expectation is either not clear or it's not understandable. In the first coaching session I had years ago, probably 15 years ago, I had a coaching session. A lady came to me and she said, "I've got a performance problem in my department." I said, "Okay, well, tell me about it." She says, "Well, so-and-so is making too many mistakes in the work that she does." And she was working in Medicare billing and it was costing money. So I asked a key question. I said, "Well, how many errors are too many?" She goes, "Well, I'm not really sure." So the thought occurred to me, well, if the supervisor's not sure of how many errors are acceptable, then I'm certain the employee is not. So we got to work on setting expectations for that. And what we often find when there's a behavior or performance problem, the first place the leader should look is in the mirror and ask a very hard question. Is it clear to this person what is expected? And many times it's not. What we know is that people follow orders better than they read minds. I hope everybody would agree with that. Key point number 4 is honesty. Just simply be factual. Don't overstate, don't exaggerate, and don't understate. And really don't sugarcoat. I don't know if everybody listening is familiar with the term sugarcoating, but we tend to water down the conversation. We tend to take something that's fairly serious and we make it sound less serious because we've been taught not to hurt people's feelings. So we water it down and as I said, we sugarcoat it. We don't need to exaggerate, but we don't need to minimize. The fifth key point is kindness. And I think that we all probably come into this having a tough conversation with the thought, well, this is not consistent with kindness. I mean, this is kind of the opposite of kindness, right? To have this kind of conversation with someone. Well, here's what I want you to think about. You have to acknowledge the person's competence and maturity to handle this. And if you withhold the feedback, if you withhold the truth, it means that you don't think they can handle it effectively. So it is important to give them the information that they need to grow, improve, and be successful. Remember how I started out? I talked about key point number one was duty. It's a requirement of leadership to develop people to their full potential. How can that happen if we're not sharing good, valid, regular, honest information with the person to help them grow? We want to have an attitude of being kind, of being helpful, of being beneficial. And none of that hold information that's important for them to grow and get better. My sixth key point is prompt intervention. And so we typically want to procrastinate. This is uncomfortable, having to meet with someone and talk to them about a defect, a mistake, a deficiency. So I would tend to want to put that off. Let me tell you, it gets more difficult to have the conversation the longer you put it off. It's never any easier to have it than it is today. The other thing is that if we don't have a prompt intervention, if we don't have a prompt conversation, we run the risk of the conversation losing effectiveness. I could see something today that I needed to talk with an employee about, but I waited 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now, and I bring the situation up to them, their recollection of it is not as sharp and crisp as it was the day it happened. So I think timing is everything. Have that conversation. If it's a minor issue, I think it's okay to have it during the coaching conversation, especially if the coaching conversation is coming up in a week or less. But putting it off too far into the future clearly hurts the effectiveness of it. So those are my key points. And I would add to this, I am not a fan of scripting a tough, critical, crucial conversation. And as I have termed it, a constructive conversation. I'm not a fan of scripting, but I think there are a few maybe key phrases that you'll want to have in your pocket to use from time to time. One of those is when you are trying to initiate this conversation with someone that needs to be had today. May I see you before you leave today? It's a very kind of neutral question to ask of the employee and lets them know that they need to come see you before they leave. So may I see you before you leave today? Another statement that is fairly neutral is to say to the person, tell me more. Now, leaders, let me tell you, you tend to talk too much during these conversations. And the reason is because you're nervous, you're anxious, you're afraid. And that causes you, if there's any silence whatsoever, it causes you to want to fill that silence. A great way to fill it is to say to the subordinate, tell me more, because you want them to share as much information as possible with you about their behavior or performance. And then we're going to find ourselves, I know I have, maybe I'm the only one who's ever had this happen, where they'll say something and I just don't know how to respond. Well, you know, as leaders, we're supposed to know how to do everything, right? We're supposed to be perfect. We're supposed to have the answer to anything that could come up. I have found myself stumped. And you know, I have this little saying available to me if I need it, and it would be, you know, I'm not sure how to respond to that. I think we're going to have to get together maybe tomorrow and continue this conversation, because it's the truth. I don't know what to say to this statement, this comment, this explanation that the leader has given me about, that the employee has given me about this particular issue. Now, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I want to go through some examples with you. According to my clock, we still have about 10 minutes or so and probably have an opportunity for a question or two. And here's an example that we've all dealt with. And if you haven't, your time is coming. Employees don't show up for work on time. I'm sure some of you have dealt with that. There we go. We got one who's willing to admit, I've dealt with this before. So when we see that the person is not at their workstation at the right time, let's just start with, what is the expectation? Now, I've heard it all. I've heard the traffic was terrible. I've heard the weather was terrible. I've heard there was a train across the tracks and I couldn't get past the train. The dog ate my homework. I mean, the list goes on and on of all the excuses. But we have to have clear expectations. So is it you're clocked in by a certain time? You're at your desk at a certain time? You're in the building at a certain time? That expectation needs to be set by the leader, and it needs to be consistently applied across all people. But occasionally you'll have to have that conversation with someone where it would be, Joe, I've observed that you're not at your workstation by 8:30 in the morning. And of course, Joe's sitting there looking at you and trying to figure out what he's going to say about that. He's trying to decide which story he's going to use today. And he acknowledges that he had some difficulties. You know, I'm not sure if it was the train, the traffic, the weather, the dog eating the homework, or what. And so this is a time when what we do as a leader is we hone the expectation. In other words, you're expected to be at your desk, at your workstation by 8:30. Now, don't go making excuses for him. Don't making it easier for him. Just stop talking at that point and allow him to say what he needs to say. But at this point, I think Joe understands you have him on this. And so that is how that constructive conversation would go. It's very straightforward. It's very matter of fact. It's certainly not cruel. It's not inhumane to have that kind of discussion. Now, I'd like to give you another example that many of you may identify with, either as an employee or as a customer. So there's a reception area at a doctor's office, and people come in and they approach the reception desk, and the receptionist there, and their job is to acknowledge the person's arrival. And the standard is that they make eye contact, they smile and ask, may I help you? Well, as a supervisor, I'm observing my receptionist. He has his head down and he seems to be working away, working. And someone approaches the desk and they're standing there, and finally they have to clear their throat to get his attention. And so at the appropriate opportunity, I would say to him, I'd say, Bob, may I have a moment with you today before you leave? And he comes in, and I can start out, I don't want to start out with something like, you know, you got to be kidding me about the way you're managing the front desk. I would start out with something like, how's it going? And he's going to say, well, it's going pretty well, something like that. And I would say, well, you know, I observed today that you were not applying our customer service standards when people approach the desk. And he says, yeah, I know, Jim, you know, you got me working on this report. You asked me to do this report for you, and I'm so busy doing that report. See, it's my fault now. I'm so busy doing this report for you that I'm so involved in that, it's hard for me to kind of do both things. And I would say at that time, honing the expectation, Bob, you know how important customer service is here. You know, it's important when people approach the desk that you acknowledge them with eye contact, a smile, and a friendly greeting like, may I help you, or good morning, or whatever may be appropriate. So that's how that conversation goes. And I could also add to that, Bob, you have an excellent record of customer service here. I've always observed, I've always believed that you were the standard for customer service here. So I know you are capable of this. I know you can do this. And if you find out that you can't deliver that and take care of getting my report done, then you need to come to me and tell me that. And we'll have to deal with that in the most effective way possible. I feel like I've got time for one more. And this is a case in which I'm working in a hospital, which is where I spent 50 years. And I've got a nurse who's coming down the hall, and she's at a fairly rapid pace. And a nurse in one of the rooms is calling for help. Help, I need help. And this nurse going down the hall makes a direct left turn into the break room. Well, that's not very good. I actually, as the manager, go into the room and help the lady who's trying to move a patient from the bed to the stretcher, but she really needed more help, and I went in and helped her. But I say to the nurse that went by and didn't help, may I have a few moments with you before you leave today? So she comes to the office, and I'd say, you know, I observed you going down the hall and ignoring one of your teammates' calls for help. And I shut up at that point. I'm silent. And she says, well, yes, I had not had a break all morning. I came in early. I hadn't even had a cup of coffee, and it was 10:30 in the morning. I would say, well, this is honing the expectation. Let's just say that patient quality and safety comes before anything. And teammate support is a close second. And my expectation is that you help out in delivering quality care. You help out supporting your teammate before you take care of that cup of coffee that you haven't had all morning. Are we in agreement on that? Well, it would be hard to say I'm not in agreement with quality patient care or teamwork, wouldn't it? So, end of conversation. We've had another constructive conversation, whether it's over the right time to be at work, whether it's over properly acknowledging our customers when they arrive, or whether it's supporting the very high ideal of quality and safety and teamwork. So those are my thoughts. I'm going to send my notes to Renee for her to distribute. I have my name and phone number and email address there. If anyone would like to communicate with me on a particular difficult situation with which you're dealing at this time, that's perfectly fine. I'm retired. I'm 72 years of age, And I enjoy working with leaders on leadership issues. And I've probably dealt with some of the same ones that you have. So I'll pause now and see if anyone has a question that they would like to address in the 3.5 minutes we have remaining. This is called Stomp the Teacher. Yeah. You like that, huh?
We'll give the opportunity for anyone to either pose or flip your camera and your mic on and practice asking the tough question, maybe.
Chicken.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask the first then. Maybe that'll warm up some others. So, Jim, thank you so much. And I think everyone can use those examples and place it in their own work setting and apply that, whether it be in hospital or finance or law. You gave 3 examples of behavior that you observed. What about behavior that has been shared with you by someone else on the team, and how you would approach that constructive conversation that could be based on secondhand information, but it is not simply from one, but from more than one member of that person's team?
I love that question. I love that question. You know, my immediate answer is always to know your source. There are people who would tell you things and you would have no idea about how credible it would be. There are other people who would tell you things you could take it to the bank, couldn't you? You know for a fact it happened. To further complicate your scenario that you gave me, the person doesn't want to be mentioned. They want to remain anonymous. So I can't go to that individual and say, well, you know, Kathy told me or Kim told me. They're going to want to know, well, who told you that? Well, I'm sorry. They asked to remain anonymous. So that can further complicate it. But I would say, first and foremost, know the credibility of your source. In my working career of 50-something years, I had people that would tell me things. It was as good as if I saw it myself. Now, I would never say that I saw it. I would say somebody told me this. But there were people also who I would have no idea. I can't do much with something where the credibility is not there. And that's unfortunate. Now, if you get into large numbers of people coming and telling you things, you obviously have a totally different matter there. But I think it's know your source. How credible are they? Are they willing? I've even had situations where the person telling me this is willing to meet and be involved in the conversation. But generally speaking, human nature is they'd rather be anonymous. They don't want anybody to use their name. They're afraid of retribution, aren't they? Thank you for that question. That's probably the best question anyone could have asked.
Yeah, that really was a really good question, Kim. And I mean, I had a question similar, not so much more specific. We have had a few cases in our department where a person has had BO, bad odor, and that's a very difficult topic to even bring to someone's attention. And so I was looking for tips on how to kind of curve that, or what would you suggest?
I think that's an awesome question and so delicate, isn't it? I used to teach in my supervisory class that leaders have to deal with all behaviors in performance. They're not things that are off limits. So this is one of those in which the manager probably knows it. And if they don't know it, someone will make them aware. And it's the leader's responsibility to have a constructive conversation with that person. I gave you the guidelines. I gave you duty. It's their duty. They're required to do that. I gave you honesty. I gave you courage. You're afraid of a little bit about how this could go, but more than anything, kindness. And it would be very delicate to say, Jack, I've got a very real concern regarding your behavior, and it regards personal hygiene. And I've had people share with me, and yes, Jack, I have observed it myself, that you can do some improving in the personal hygiene area. And so I'm asking that you please, now that this has been brought to your attention, I'm going to ask that you address this. And do I have your assurance that you will? And that's about as delicate as you can put it, isn't it? You okay with that? It's a leader's responsibility. I clearly don't think it's the responsibility of the coworker. If I'm the coworker, I'm going to tell my supervisor if they don't already know it. But I don't think that's the responsibility of a coworker. That's a leadership job there. And that's why being a leader is not for everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, like the employee actually, they did get better, but then I don't know if they got worse again. And it's not something that you really want to reprimand them for, but I don't know if you will even consider it medical.
Well,
So you got to kind of be careful about.
I think it is the responsibility of the employee to address this issue, because what we know is if coworkers know it, the customer knows it. I'm not sure what the business is you're in. Let's say you're in the hotel and restaurant business. Customers know it. It's offensive, and it has to be dealt with. And we're always dealing with this curve where it gets better, it gets worse. You got to talk to them again. Then it gets better. Then all of a sudden it gets worse again. And I think the leader has to have regular conversation with that person. And at some point you may have to say, you working here and having bad hygiene don't go together. I don't know how I could say it any clearer. If you continue to have a problem, see, I worked in an industry where we had a ban on fragrance. Not allowed to wear perfume or cologne in a hospital. It's kind of the opposite problem. But people are allergic to fragrance. And so therefore nurses and other healthcare workers were not allowed to wear fragrance to work. But that's a very serious issue. And it could involve having a filthy uniform. It could involve just having an overall terrible appearance. Appearance matters. Let me tell you, it affects first impression. And first impression is as important as that receptionist not looking up when that patient shows up at the reception desk. That creates a bad first impression. And so that's going to have to be addressed, and it's going to have to be a sustaining address to it, not a sporadic, not it gets better, it gets worse, it gets better. No, it's got to be solved completely.
So Jim, we have one question dropped in the chat, and that might put us toward the end since these are designed to be power, quick fire, but your friend and colleague, Henry Simons, has asked this. If you could provide your definition of leadership, and that could help clarify actions to be taken regarding these tough conversations. So give us a bit of a personal perspective definition you have of leadership.
Well, there are a lot of definitions, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of the experts in leadership make it too complicated. I think of leadership as moving people in the direction of the vision and the goals of the organization. If you are a real leader, you move people more emotionally than anything, because leaders have to inspire and motivate people. If you can't inspire and motivate people like Henry Simons can, then you really have to ask yourself, should I be wearing this leadership hat? Because that's what leaders do. They move people in the direction of the organization's vision and goals. And that's as simple as I could talk about character. I would love to have the conversation, are leaders born or made? And we could have a good discussion around that. And my answer would be this: Yes. Which is kind of confusing, isn't it? Leaders have to come to the table with a foundation upon which to build. That's the born part. But if leaders couldn't be developed, I wouldn't have this whole bookcase back here full of leadership development books, because leaders can be developed, but there has to be a foundation upon which to build. And you know what? You know it when you see it. You really do. I mean, you've worked with people. If you're at least 30 years of age, you've worked with enough people, you know whether people had the foundation that could be built upon.
Thank you so
enjoyed
much.
that discussion. Thank you very much, Renee, for inviting me. And I consider it an honor to speak before these outstanding people today and to try to do my best to answer their questions.
Thank you so much, Jim, for your time. And I think that we would probably all agree on this call that we would love to sit and chat for even longer, and be similar situation as you and me yesterday in our 10-minute tech run through. It turned into an enjoyable hour-long conversation and everything.
Yes,
so we thank everybody for being here. Again, we'll send out notes that Jim has prepared to y'all's email addresses. It has his contact information, and if there was a question that you didn't feel comfortable asking in front of everyone, he would love to know what that is. And we just encourage you all to join us next week on May 12th, as we have another power session with Mary Dell Hayes, who is going to talk to us about another aspect of leadership between boards and their executive directors, and how we can all, in our various capacities, serve as beneficial board members. So go to columbiachamber.com to sign up for that. And Jim, we thank you again for your time, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.